As my kid has transitioned from childhood to teenagerhood, they asked if we could redo their entire room. My next couple videos are going to follow this process, but for logistic purposes, we started off with the closet. Based on the child's inputs, this is what I came up with. I started off with some beech veneered plywood. The closet itself is about 2 feet by 5 feet, so it is not big. And to help open up the room as well as the closet, the doors are going to be removed permanently. To make sure all my shelves would be lined up straight, I gang cut my dados. By cutting both sides of each shelf out of the same piece of plywood with the same dados used, I was able to make sure they lined up perfectly. And I was getting a little bit more tear out than I would have liked with the router bit I was using, so I used the blue tape to minimize that. After routing out the dados, I used the table saw to cut each side of the shelf modules to their final dimensions. For the 2 modules that I made this closet out of, 3 of the 4 sides would never be visible. So I kept the side to shelf joinery simple and used screws. The dados on the other side of this piece are pretty much for shelf alignment and load bearing. Right here I'm just temporarily putting everything together to see how it fits and to prepare for face frame cutting. A couple of cross pieces needed to be added to the back to prevent racking and to keep everything square, and for those I just used some scrap plywood. These pieces will also give me a way to attach the module to the wall when it comes time for install. I made the face frames and drawer faces out of solid beech. I went with beech for this project, mainly because in my neck of the woods it's pretty inexpensive, it's nice to work with, and the color that my kid wanted for all the furniture in the room was going to necessitate staining, and beech takes stain pretty well. I built my face frames on the towers themselves to make sure that everything would fit perfectly. To connect the face frames, I could have used half-lap joinery, but that would have taken a lot more time and effort than I was willing to put into the job. And because these pieces are only 1 inch wide, pocket screws were out because I would have only been able to get 1 screw per joint. So I went with dominoes. I glued these up while attached to the modules the same way I cut them to make sure everything would line up right. Before I proceeded any further, I needed to start thinking about provisions for all the wiring for the lights I was going to install, and that started with the switch. It's pretty hard to find a decent switch that's shallower than 3/4 of an inch, so I had to cut a hole through one side of a cabinet and then make a recess in the other so everything would fit properly. And since this would never be seen, it didn't really matter about all that terrible tear out. Before I could add more provisions for the wiring, I needed to disassemble both modules. I've made an LED lit closet before, and on the last one I learned a lot of things that made this one a lot easier. If you'd like to watch that video, there's a link in the upper right hand corner. Anyway, to start with, I cut dados in the shelves for the light tracks themselves. I also cut long dados in each module to make wiring chases. These will give me plenty of room to connect all the lights simply and neatly. Right now it just looks like I'm putting a lot of holes and grooves in plywood, but by the end of the video it'll all make sense. This might seem a little disjointed, but I also rough cut all my drawer faces at this point to make sure that they would fit and to have decent spacing. With that out of the way, I proceeded to sand all the surfaces that would get finish. Next, I reassembled both modules and I used dominoes to attach the face frames. Alright, so let's talk about the elephant in the room, because I realized around 2 days ago that I had made some mistakes here. So these screws on the top row were never going to be an issue, because there's going to be this bracket that'll hold the top shelf. This row initially wasn't going to be an issue for the same reason, and I figured I can live with 3 right in the middle. Not a big deal. However, this is going to hold the closet rod, as is the one up here. And in standing back, I realized that is not big enough to hang anything. So this needs to be more like there. So there'd be so it would be tall enough to be able to hang shirts on the top and the bottom. So I got to do something about these 2 rows of screws. This is called turning a mistake into a design feature. To hide the screws, I first needed to route out some dados. This would have been a lot easier to do before the face frames were installed, but I was still able to get it done. I really didn't want any tear out, so I pre-scored these cuts. Not perfect, but good enough for a teenager's closet and a vast improvement over the screws. Because I'm going to use side mount drawer slides, I needed to add some 1/4-inch thick spacers so that they would properly fit with the face frames. And once these went in, I was able to proceed with building the drawers themselves. We decided to go with hand-hold cutouts instead of drawer pulls. I 3D printed up a template. I designed in a center alignment mark to make lining everything up as easy as possible. After marking the cutout, I rough cut it on the bandsaw, leaving about a 1/16 of an inch of excess. Then I attached the template to the drawer face with some double-sided tape. Lastly, a flush cut bit finished the job. With that out of the way, I started building the drawer boxes with some 1/2-inch thick birch plywood. To facilitate the hand-hold cutout, I had to have one side of the drawer box a little bit narrower than the other 3. Because of this, I also needed to edge band that narrower piece before I assembled the drawers themselves. I used some iron-on edge banding to do this. While trimming the edge banding on my first piece, I got a little overzealous with the block plane. This wasn't anything some CA glue couldn't fix though. After I got my finger unstuck, I decided to slow down a little bit and I narrowed the mouth on the block plane so that wouldn't happen again. There's lots of different ways to apply and trim edge banding. In the past I've used a trim router, though I don't really like that because the glue gets gummed up on the bit. You can also buy specialized tools for this, but I'm pretty happy just using what I've got. With the short pieces edge banded, I cut grooves for the drawer bottoms. I used rabbet joints with nails for the very back joints on the drawer boxes, so I cut those now. Because the front piece of the drawer boxes were shorter than the sides, I decided to do those with dominoes. I did it this way so the front side of the drawer would have strong joints and no exposed nail holes. One of the last things I did before sanding and assembling the drawer boxes was I pre-drilled screw holes for the drawer faces. I glued the front domino jointed half of the drawer box together and let it dry before I proceeded. These drawers are only roughly 18 inches square, so I was able to get away with using 1/8 inch thick hardboard for the bottoms. And once all the bottom panels were cut, I was able to finish assembling the drawer boxes. Once I got to this stage, I was able to finish doing the edge banding on the other 3 sides of the drawer box. In the past I've gotten comments like, why didn't you use soft close drawer slides or undermount drawer slides? So I'll answer that question right now. I salvaged this set of drawer slides out of an old dresser that I had made several years ago and have since gotten rid of. I was trying to keep the total cost of this closet build under $600, so this saved me probably $80 to $100 right there. As it turns out, the single biggest line item expense on this build were the sheets of plywood that I used. The plywood expenses added up to about $380 total. I reused scraps or salvaged hardware wherever I could, so I kept the overall price of this build below my $600 threshold, but not by much. Anyway, once the drawers were sorted out, I made the last shelves to facilitate the closet rods. I wanted everything to be able to be installed directly into the prepared closet cavity without having any real work to do inside there. Accordingly, I pre-made all the brackets for the upper shelf and the closet rods themselves. The lower shelf isn't very big, but it's only supported on 2 sides, so I had to make it fairly robust. I used dominoes to attach the one exposed side so there wouldn't be any visible fasteners, but for the back panel I went ahead and used pocket screws. I added 2 cleats to the drawer module for additional shelf support. The drawer boxes were finished with 2 coats of General Finishes high performance satin. Everything else was finished with Rubio Monocoat charcoal, which my kid picked out. We did the finishing together, so we didn't get a lot of footage of it. Once I got all the drawer slides reinstalled, it was time to install the drawer faces. I used playing cards as shims so I could get the narrow gaps even on all sides. Once the faces were fully installed and any final adjustments were made, I added the last screws. These lock the drawer slides in place so everything stays where you want it. For the lights on this closet, I used aluminum tracks with diffusers, which is not something I've done a whole lot of in the past. I cut the aluminum tracks to length and then I glued them into the dados that I had cut earlier. I'll include links for all the lighting components in the description. I was able to get everything I needed on Amazon for less than $85. For the first module of 6 cubbies, I built up a simple wiring harness. I cut up 5 different sections of wire, each about 16 inches long, and then soldered the ends together. I'm using 12-volt strip lights, so it's very important to keep the polarity straight or they won't work. I also have these little screw-type connectors, which are a lot better to use than what I did on my first closet build. I kept each section of wire in the harness a little bit long, so it would make connecting these a lot easier. Even 2 to 3 inches of slack makes a world of difference. I cannibalized the female end from the dimmer switch that my lights came with to make a tester. These only run at 12 volts, so the risk of shock is pretty much nil. Once I was sure everything would work, I finished installing the LED strips to the aluminum tracks. The diffusers clip into those aluminum tracks and they cut pretty easily. And when you're done, you end up with a pretty nice professional looking product. I used some small zip ties to take up the rest of the slack that was left in the wires after everything else was installed. A little bit of hot glue was used to keep everything in place. For this module, one final wire was installed that would eventually go to a main junction box. That junction box is in the other module, and here you can see I kept one drawer short to facilitate its installation. This module had a few more details to worry about that the other one didn't, one being the switch. Another little quirk of the wiring that I had to account for is I needed to have a single wire come out of the nice finished side of the module. I used some drip irrigation tubing along with little clips that I 3D printed to be able to keep the wire protected. To give you an idea of what's going on here, there's an outlet in the closet, which will be right here where this drawer is shallow to create room for it, along with the junction box. The 12-volt transformer from the outlet will plug in here, where it will connect to the switch wire and the leads from the other 2 sections, here and here, as well as this wire that comes in from the cubby section. And that'll all get tied in together on install day. One of the wires that goes to the shelf, the middle shelf, comes through here and wraps around and forward through that tubing to where it comes out right here, where it will go into the track with that section of LEDs once it's installed. Up top, this light continues through and then we'll get wired to the next section. So those will be the only 2 sections of lights that are actually, well, this top here is the only section of lights that'll be in series. And here you can see how the cubby section wiring goes up through the channel. Same for the drawer section. Comes up from the bottom. Here's the switch. The contacts for the switch are actually on the other side, and then goes up to the lower shelf and then the upper. The holders for the closet rods were also 3D printed, and I installed those now. A little bit of black paint pen took care of those shiny screw heads. The installation went really smooth. The center module is attached to the wall and the cubby module is attached to it. The 2 shelves are attached to both the wall and the center module. The overall design ended up really maximizing the storage space, as well as I think looked pretty classy. But of course what I think doesn't really matter, but my kid is really happy. Hopefully you enjoyed this, and if you catch my next couple of videos, you'll see what else we're going to do in this room. Thanks for watching.